currently chairing a global negotiating process which is developing a standard that Bobby Godsall spoke to just now, ISO 26000. And what I think is a fascinating process and a fascinating standard that adds, I think, a great deal more meat to the skeleton of the Global Compact. It adds a huge amount more detail as to what constitute international norms of behavior on human rights and environmental issues, and I would encourage you to have a look at that. So I'm going to share observations on what I've seen in the last 20 years in this field. And I'm going to preface it with two key thoughts. Firstly, the thought which every other speaker has raised today, and that is that we're moving into a time of increasing turbulence and increasing uncertainty. And I think environmental issues are going to really ratchet up the nature of that turbulence. It's fascinating to see how an environmental issue, the volcano, has absolutely brought to a halt some of the economic activity in Europe and challenged some of our assumptions. The second sort of prefacing comment is around the role of business. I mean, it's a teasing irony. There's no doubt it's been part of the problem, and in many respects still is. But it's fundamentally going to be part of the solution. There's no disputing that they've got the capacity, they have the reach, the technology, the financial resources to address the challenges of environmental sustainability. The question we have to ask is whether they have sufficient motivation. And I think in the context of the global financial crisis, we can really start to query some of the underlying motivations of some in business. Looking back in the last 10 years, since when I joined ESCOM in 1991, there's a huge amount that has happened. We've seen the consolidation of the institutionalization of the business response. We've seen the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the GRI, the Global Compact, the PRI, you name it. Every single sector has its own voluntary initiative. A huge amount has happened in one respect. But in another respect, I find it profoundly frustrating that actually not much has happened, that some of the underlying concerns at a systemic level haven't shifted to the level that I think we need. And why is that? Well, I came across recently when I was in Australia a chap called Bob Fletcher. He started Fletcher Pickle in Australia. And he had, I think, as an old man, profound wisdom on the issue of environmental sustainability in the corporate sector. And he said the following: if it will save us money and be good for the environment, we'll do it. If it will not cost us anything and be good for the environment, we'll probably do it. If it will cost us money, you'd better regulate. And I think that's the underlying disconnect, is that there's this disconnect between the interests of the corporation and the interests of society in a particular time frame. Now, if we look at governance and King 3 and read it with section 76.3 of the Companies Act, and we look at what is expected of directors: to act in good faith, to act in the best interests of the company, and to show due care, skill, and diligence, and have appropriate knowledge, skill, and experience. Now, if we look at those elements, we've really got to ask ourselves, what happens when there's this disconnect between protecting the interests of the company, which is your duty as a director, and the interests of society? Now, if we listened to Bobby Godsall earlier, it's very clear that business is part of society. So presumably, acting in society's interests are the same as acting in business interests. But it's clear that that's not the case. Not as the link is not as profound as it should be. There are many instances when it's in the interests of business to externalize costs on broader society. So we face this disconnect between your fiduciary duty and serving the interests of society. And I'd be interested on your reflections from the three companies here. Do you find that the short-term focus from shareholders results in you doing some form of window dressing? Does it hinder you to be more brave in real systemic innovation in your companies because we're responding to what Godsall referred to as, I think, the 23-year-old hedge fund and analysts and investors? So are we seeing this trade-off between perpetual earning growth at the expense of what I'm going to speak to now of organizational agility? It then also raises the question, if we look again at the Companies Act, around what is appropriate knowledge, skill, and experience on the board? Recently, I interviewed a senior member of the PIC, and he said, if I could do one thing, it would be to require that no chartered accountant becomes chief executive officer. Now, it was a fairly flip comment, but I think actually one which had some depth and profundity in it. The issue is, does the skill set of a chartered accountant who's good at managing widgets and balance sheets and so on, is that the skill set that we require of organizations operating in the context of current societal turbulence? If not, what are the skill sets that we expect of people managing boards? Do we need to see others on the board that have the ability to challenge some of the decisions around environmental and social issues? I find it worrying in my engagements with certain companies now that when you scratch a little on the surface, there's still profound levels of skepticism in many companies as to why should we do anything about climate change. And an interesting disconnect between where the science is at, or where policy is going, and where some in business are at. If one looks at King 3, I think rightly we should applaud it for what it says. I think if you look at its 5 underlying principles, are profound in terms of what it says around environmental sustainability. And I don't think their profundity is necessarily sufficiently appreciated by some who are seeking to conform with King 3. Let's look at those 5 principles. Leadership is the first one. Sustainability, and I'll quote the words from that because I think they're particularly useful. Innovation, fairness, and collaboration. Profound. Let's have real innovation. Let's look at fairness and addressing issues around inequality, and let's look at real collaboration rather than competition. Fourthly, it talks about integrating sustainability with social transformation. And then finally, it talks about integrated sustainability reporting. Now, the interesting thing is, for many companies, when they're doing sustainability, it's the last one of those that is the one they're focusing on. Is we've got to do a sustainability report, help us make it integrated, whatever that means, and then we've done sustainability. But if you look at what King 3 says about sustainability, and I'm going to read these words, and I know the author of these words is in the room, but I think they're really good words. And I'll read them. Sustainability is the primary moral and economic imperative for the 21st century, and one of the most important sources of both opportunities and risks for business. Nature, society, and business are interconnected in complex ways that need to be understood by decision makers. Most importantly, current incremental changes towards sustainability are not sufficient. We need a fundamental shift in the way companies and directors act and organize themselves. End of quote. Now let's unpack some of the elements here. Firstly, it's an economic imperative. It's about risks and opportunities. Many of the companies that we've been dealing with through the Carbon Disclosure Project and other areas are still seeing this as risk management and as compliance. I don't think that many are sufficiently appreciating some of the interesting opportunities that environmental challenges are going to present for business. They speak about the moral imperative. It's often a challenge to go into a boardroom and be seen to speak about morals and ethics, to be frank. You need to go in there and sell, I believe, the business case. And I asked this of my business students, and I teach MBAs here. Do you think there's a role for values in the boardroom? And we have a frank discussion, and for many of them they say, unless we can see that it pays in the short period, then no, there isn't. If we can just dilly-dally and get around it, then no, there isn't. And that's slightly worrying. But I think it reflects the reality, and in some respect reflects this issue of acting in the best interests of the company. Now, surely in time, you can show and make a strong case that the ethical company, in the long run, is the better performing company. But there's still that disconnect between what many of the shareholders are seeking from you. It talks about interconnectedness and systems thinking. And I don't think we're really joining the dots to the extent that need to be joined in terms of the interconnectedness between environmental issues and social issues. We're absolutely not going to get social justice in this country without addressing environmental issues.